This is a panel on real security. We want to pick up this debate. However, I've just lost it there. We want to pick up the discussion that we started this morning about the need to move the debate about our foreign and military policies beyond simply an opposition to the war in Iraq, which we now have established really as the consensus position of the Democratic Party, which it wasn't even as early as a year ago. But now begin to challenge the broader tenets of an American policy. And let me just say a couple words about that. You know, one of the famous facts that we all know is that we spend more on health care per capita than any other country, and we cover fewer people and have higher, worse levels of life expectancy and what have you. We're spending more money and getting much less. And arguably, that is also true in this area. We are spending 45% of the world's military budget with, as I said, 737 bases in over 130 countries. And arguably, we are less secure and more vulnerable. And we feel that lack of security and vulnerability than ever. Chalmers Johnson, this wonderful professor who's a scholar of China and Asia studies, has written a series of books about the crisis of this empire. And he's raised the question about whether America will go forward as an empire or as a republic, arguing that increasingly you're going to have to make a choice. And that the Bush administration, with its imperial presidency and its assertion of the powers and prerogatives of the president to make war on whom he chooses, having done that, to be able to designate his enemies as enemy combatants and then be able to surveil them, to arrest them without charges, to hold them indefinitely, and to continue this as long as the war will last, and with the war on terror, the war will last, he says, forever. This is an extraordinary set of powers that go with an imperial sensibility. And I think that's one of the questions we have to face. The other one is the reverse of that in some sense. Here we are, the world's global cop. We sustain our fleet, we police the seas, we attempt to create a preponderance of military power in every major, quote, theater of the world, unquote, so that we will be the power that faces off against China and Asia, against Russia and Eurasia, against Iran and the Persian Gulf, against relationship to Western Europe, etc. We will be the dominant power, and we will not allow our allies to begin to threaten that power. At the same time, we're running a deficit of, it's now a current account deficit that's now up around $800 billion a year. This entire national or international posture is dependent on the kindness of foreign bankers continuing to finance our posture. We look less and less like a mighty empire and more like Hessians, if you will. I think these are big questions we have to face, and we have to face them in the context of emerging security issues that really have no military answer. And so this is a wonderful panel. I'm very pleased to begin this debate. I believe this has to be something that we, as progressives, have to challenge and have to push into politics in the same way that we challenged the Iraq War and have changed opinion on that. To start us off, it's a pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey, who is a representative from California's 6th District, now in her 8th term. Lynn is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, where she has been a leading advocate of progressive issues, particularly those dealing with children and families. Of course, in the last few years, she is one of the leading, most passionate, outspoken opponents of the Iraq War, and she has played a major role in moving opinion both in the Congress and in the country against that failed Iraq policy. In her role as the leader of the Progressive Caucus, Lynn has helped develop a broader security policy, a different way of looking at security. And so we asked her to come and speak about that today. Lynn Woolsey.
Well, thank you, Bob. I really wanted to come and rail about the occupation in Iraq, believe me. But I will be saying a little bit about that. You can't be living in today's world and be a progressive and not refer to what's going on every day around us. But thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And you have to know it is a really big treat to be hanging out with a bunch of fellow progressives today. Thank you. We've been through a lot together, all of us, from freedom fries to the current surge, but through it all, you've stayed true. You've stayed true to our progressive values, our principles of peace. You've stayed true to knowing that what real democracy is all about, and you've stayed true and compassionate for the people of the world. And I thank you for that. It is so important for us. So I want to begin by saluting all of you, because you've kept the progressive movement alive, you've kept it well, and on the march. Don't think that it's not on the march, because it is. And it's on the march, despite some pretty big odds. So again, thank you. As for me, it's been a great honor to help lead the progressive cause in the Congress and to serve as co-chair, along with Representative Barbara Lee, of the 72-member Progressive Caucus. Our Executive Director, Bill Gould, is here today, so thank you. He keeps us halfway organized and focused, and we certainly do appreciate him for that. And I'm proud to say that I stood with the progressive vote against giving the president the authority to go to war, and for being the first member of Congress to call upon the president to end the war. This Take Back America conference couldn't have come at a better time. We progressives have to join together as never before, because this president is moving in a new and even more dangerous direction than we could have ever imagined regarding foreign policy. So let me just give you an example. Several weeks ago, the president confirmed what I've been saying ever since the invasion of Iraq. Namely, he is determined to maintain tens of thousands of American troops on permanent military bases in Iraq for many decades to come. To support this position, he drew a comparison, an unimaginable comparison between the situation in Iraq and the situation in South Korea, where U.S. troops have been stationed for more than 50 years. And then the White House spokesman, Tony Snow, said U.S. troops may have to stay in Iraq indefinitely to perform what he called an over-the-horizon support role. Over-the-horizon support role. George Orwell couldn't have said it any better. Call it what it really is, Tony. It's occupation. Ever since George Bush first took us into Iraq, I've tried to get at the heart of what is wrong with his foreign policy, and actually with what is wrong with American foreign policy. I believe the answer is this. The president's foreign policy has failed because it sells America short. He believes that the only weapon we have to fight terrorism is military power. But by relying on military power alone and ignoring our many other strengths as a nation, he has made America much weaker, not stronger. Listen to the words of Professor G. John Eikenberry of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Professor Eikenberry has written, and I quote him, "If American power is measured not only in terms of hard military power, but as a larger bundle of assets which include prestige, credibility, respect, and the ready support of close allies, The United States has just witnessed the most massive collapse in national power in the country's history. Professor Eikenberry has also put his finger on why the neocon worldview has collapsed. He writes, "The Bush foreign policy offers the world a system in which America rules the world but does not abide by the rules. As the Iraq episode shows, under these circumstances, other countries will tend to undersupply cooperation. So the U.S. will find itself incurring the opposition and resistance of other states. This is the point," he continues, "when the conservative unipolar vision becomes unsustainable." Let me repeat this last sentence. This is the point when the conservative vision becomes unsustainable. The American people have made it crystal clear that they agree that we have reached that point. The conservative vision has truly failed. But that is no cause to rejoice, because now the ball is in our court. We have the responsibility to offer an alternative vision, a progressive vision that will take America in a new direction. But what should that agenda be? In my view, the progressive agenda for security should include the following. First, we must reestablish our moral leadership and regain our standing in the global community by using diplomacy as our first and best resort, and war only as our last resort. President Roosevelt said that the presidency is preeminently a place of moral leadership, and that is something this president needs to learn. Second, we must rebuild our international alliances. We may be a superpower, but we don't have superpowers like Spider-Man. So we need the help of other nations. International cooperation is by far the best way to dismantle terrorist networks. Manage globalization. Stop the spread of disease and global warming, and fight the poverty that is the breeding ground of terrorism. Third, we must stop using fear as an excuse to justify immoral wars or as a bludgeon to crush dissent and trash our Constitution. Again, quoting President Roosevelt, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." I mean, we all hear that. We know who said that. President Bush believes that without fear, he can't move his agenda. I mentioned Roosevelt twice because you can't mention his name too often at a progressive convention. Fourth, we must end our addiction to foreign oil that pumps billions of dollars into autocratic regimes and props them up. Let's get serious about sustainable energy, and let's export green technology instead of war. Next, we must renew our commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. It's sheer hypocrisy to demand that Iran and North Korea halt their nuclear programs while we talk about developing new nuclear weapons of our own. And finally, we must take the money that we are investing in war and reinvest it in what makes us truly strong: our education, our health care, jobs, child care for families, the environment, and nonviolent problem solving. What a concept. It's where you put your money where your mouth is, actually. I've offered a national security plan which rests on these broad principles. It is called SMART. It stands for Sensible Multilateral American Response to Terrorism. This plan was developed with the help and guidance of Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Women's Action for New Directions. SMART is deadly serious about stopping acts of terrorism. It would beef up our intelligence capabilities and enhance our efforts to cut off financing for terrorist organizations. SMART also focuses on stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction, not by deposing regimes that don't have them, but with diplomacy, vigorous inspection regimes, and regional security arrangements. SMART calls for a renewed commitment to the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, a program which actually has been successful in securing loose nuclear materials in the former Soviet Union. It would also reshuffle our national security budget. No more billions of dollars thrown at Cold War weapons programs designed for the last century. The money would instead be invested in energy independence and other efforts to make us safe in this century. Any smart approach to national security must address the root causes of terrorism, like instability, despair, and hopelessness. So my proposal includes an ambitious international development program for impoverished nations. This includes debt relief, democracy building, schooling for women and girls, human rights education, environmental programs, infrastructure development, and more. The occupation of Iraq has already cost us nearly $450 billion, enough to fully fund global anti-hunger efforts for 14 years, or worldwide AIDS programs for 34 years. Think how much more secure we would be if we had been smart about the way we spent our money. I invite you to learn more about SMART by visiting my website, and I know that John Cavanagh will be here's his book, we got to all have it, will be discussing his plan called Just Security, and I know that it reflects all of the good thinking and a lot of good ideas that we need to be building on. And all of this will give all of us a lot to think about and a lot of encouragement. So ladies and gentlemen, we have a full panel, so I want to get out of the way so they can speak too. But I want to end by saying that I look forward to working with all of you, and together we can advance the progressive agenda, because it is America's agenda. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
If you want to read the SMART agenda, it's on the Congresswoman's congressional website. I recommend it to you. Our next speaker here is an associate of the Center for International Policy. He is a veteran of 24 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and has been a professor at the National War College for 16 years. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Failure of Intelligence, The Decline and Fall of the Central Intelligence Agency. But perhaps more interestingly for our purposes, his last book, Bush League Diplomacy, laid out very clearly and very early just how wrong neoconservatives had the world and how they were leading this country astray. It's a pleasure to introduce Mel Goodman.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for mentioning Bush League Diplomacy, because a lot of people thought it was a book about baseball. And Amazon.com put it in their sports section. But maybe it sold more that way. I just don't know. I think I want to use half my time to explain why we're here at this juncture, why we need a new security agenda, and then make the points that I think need to be made. And I won't repeat Lynn's fine points on what is needed for a new security agenda. I think it's very important to remind ourselves about the inheritance that the Bush administration has squandered. Because on 3 levels, he had an incredible international inheritance. He had an incredible economic inheritance because of 8 years of the Clinton administration, and particularly Robert Rubin and their management of the global economy. Now we're indulging in global commitments with borrowed money. We don't have that successful economic position that we had in 1992 and throughout the 90s. Bush has also totally squandered the diplomatic inheritance that he had from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the end of the Cold War, which put the United States in an extremely important position geopolitically to try to manage the global community along with its key allies. That's been squandered. And finally, he has squandered the international inheritance in terms of the sympathy and support we had from the rest of the world in the wake of 9/11, when even Le Monde had a headline that said we are all Americans. All of that has been lost. All of that has been wasted. And I think it's important to spend a few minutes just on the people, the processes, and the policies of the Bush administration that have put us in the worst security position we've been in since the end of World War II. The people are known to all of us, and the fortunate thing about this particular point is a lot of these people are leaving or have already left. Rumsfeld is gone, and he gratuitously assigned Europe into two categories, Old Europe and New Europe, putting our best World War allies in the category of Old Europe. Wolfowitz is gone, which is extremely important. Scooter Libby, who seemed to think he was the fall guy for what happened during the run-up to the war in Iraq and the Valerie Plame affair, and doesn't understand that the fall guys for this war are the 3,500 young men and women who have already lost their lives in Iraq. Scooter Libby is not a fall guy, and he belongs in jail. J.D. Crouch is gone. Bob Josephs, who wrote the famous 16 words that was in the State of the Union address, the great lie that helped to get us into this war, is gone. But as long as Dick Cheney is there, as long as Bob Gates is there, because it's Bob Gates who's also used the Korea paradigm to explain what in the world we're doing in Iraq, we're going to have difficulty. Now let's look at the process. The process was wrong from the start. This is the most profligate decision that any president has ever made in national security affairs, the worst decision any president has ever made. And it was made because of our nightmares. It wasn't made because of our ideals. When you go to war, it should be for your ideals. When we went to war successfully in World War I and World War II, and I would add the Korean War to that list, and even Bosnia and Kosovo, we were supporting ideals that were very important to the United States. When you ignore those ideals and you go to war because of your nightmares, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq, you create new nightmares. Vietnam certainly created new nightmares for the United States. And when you look around today in a world of secret prisons and extraordinary renditions and torture and abuse and Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and you wonder, is this America? You know, what has happened to this country in the last 6.5 years? And then you look at the policies of the Bush administration. The policies not only with regard to war, but how quickly and thoroughly George Bush has ended the very important arms control and disarmament movement that was a bipartisan ideal in Washington going back to the Eisenhower administration. The way he was able to abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was really the cornerstone of deterrence and the cornerstone of détente, was remarkable. And then to replace that with a national missile defense, a system that goes back 50 years on which we've wasted hundreds of billions of dollars, and now Bush wants to expand this into Eastern Europe with missiles in Poland and radars in the Czech Republic, is just mind-boggling. It's a system that doesn't work. The leading scientists of this country say it will never be made to work because no system will ever be able to recognize a decoy from the real thing, and we have made no progress whatsoever in dealing with this particular problem. And then people wonder why the Soviets and now the Russians are so concerned with national missile defense in East Europe. Well, people forget very quickly something we told the Soviets when we were trying to negotiate them out of East Germany. Remember, they had 300,000 troops when Germany was reunified in 1990 and 1991. And we didn't have a lot of leverage for getting them out of there. But one of the things that Secretary of State James Baker and President George Herbert Walker Bush said to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze was that if you leave East Germany, we will not leapfrog East Germany to go into Eastern Europe. And of course, that's what we did with the expansion of NATO in 1997, which I thought was terribly wrong. And then to expand that expansion in 2002, and now to put missiles in East Europe. Do we want another Cold War? Bob Gates said one Cold War was enough. These are policies of a Cold War, which is exactly why the Russians are so concerned. And then you look at what Bush did in terms of the Middle East on the first day of his first term in 2001. The first two people in the Clinton administration who were told to leave were Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller. I don't know if those names are familiar to all of you, but I think they are to most of you. Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller were the institutional memory for this government, both Democrats and Republicans, for all of the Israeli-Arab agreements over the past 10 to 20 years. They were told to leave. Their services were no longer needed. That was because Bush had no interest whatsoever in diplomacy, no interest in moving Israel along to some kind of satisfactory arrangement with Arab neighbors and particularly with the Palestinians. And really, we haven't tried diplomacy anywhere. If you look at the situations that have evolved, and they were far more serious problems than Iraq ever was when we invaded Iraq in 2003, and of course I'm talking about the Iranian situation and the North Korean situation, these situations are begging for some diplomatic approach. And this administration is totally bankrupt in terms of what to do about these very important national security issues. So what needs to be done? Of course we need to end the war. The sad thing about this war is we know it's over. And again, you think of Vietnam. We knew Vietnam was over in January 1968 with the North Korean offensive that took us totally by surprise. But it took another 7 years to get out of Vietnam and 25,000 more Americans, and we don't know how many Vietnamese died during this period. We're in the same situation in Iraq. We know the war was over. And it's over for one very simple reason. Whenever this country has tried a policy based on nothing but regime change, we have failed. Think about this strategically and geopolitically. Iran in 1953, regime change against a democratically elected government to bring in a tyrant like the Shah. Guatemala, and think of how many indigenous Indians died in Guatemala at the hands of regimes that we introduced into power. Chile, again, we overthrew a democratically elected government. The Congo, the assassination attempt against Lumumba that brought in the worst tyrant in the history of Africa in terms of Mobutu. The regime change in Vietnam in 1963, which left the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration without any ally to work with whatsoever. And of course, Saddam Hussein. Of course we could overthrow Saddam Hussein. Of course American power could do that. But as Lynn said, in terms of the superpower, this superpower notion is the most insidious idea that has ever come down the pike to explain American power. Yes, we could overthrow Saddam Hussein. Could we introduce an alternative? Could we bring in a successor state? Do we have a centralized government in Iraq that works? Do we have any commitment toward political reform? Except these laughable notions, this pipe dream about democratizing Iraq and then democratizing the entire Middle East, which even people such as Thomas Friedman of the New York Times bought whole hog and wrote about for years and years and years. So all this has to be done in terms of Iraq. We have to get back to a strategic concept with regard to the entire Middle East. You cannot build a viable Iraq with some legitimacy while we don't have relations with Iran and we don't have an ambassador in Syria. We need bilateral talks with these countries, not so much for our purposes, but for the purposes of their neighbors. Iraq is not going to be stable unless we have good relations with Syria and Iran. And frankly, we're not contributing very much to Israeli stability with the policies we've pursued toward the Palestinians, toward the Syrians, and toward the Lebanese. We have to get back to arms control, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the chemical and biological conventions to limit those two weapon systems. We have to anchor Russia to the international community. NATO expansion, as I said, was wrong. Deploying missiles in Eastern Europe is wrong. All we have to do is go back to George Kennan's containment policy. And the very last aspect of containment, which no one ever talks about anymore, is that once the Soviet Union is dissolved, and once Russia wants to be part of the international community, as it does, it is time to anchor Russia to that international security system that indeed exists. And that's what we should be doing, not putting on pressure on Russia by building up relations in Central Asia and in Eastern Europe that are just going to make for very difficult situations in both those key regions. And finally, we have to do two things that won't cost this government very much, but could save us a lot. And that is the demilitarization of national security policy. I don't think we've thoroughly analyzed the degree to which the Pentagon has taken over this city. When I lobbied against the appointment of Robert Gates, when I went down to the Senate before he was confirmed, I was appalled to see how many senators were going to vote for him because they treated Bob Gates as the morning after pill. He was the guy who was going to abort Donald Rumsfeld. Well, frankly, that is just not good enough. Gates was nominated as a CIA director in 1987, and he had to pull back his nomination because he lied about Iran-Contra. When he was nominated in 1991, there were over 30 votes against him because of his role in politicizing intelligence against the Soviet Union for the entire period of the 1980s, along with William Casey, the CIA director. So I think these are some of the policies that we have to pursue. We have to limit the power of the Pentagon. We're going to have to rebuild the power of the State Department. The State Department barely exists. There is very little expertise that comes out of the State Department or the National Security Council on any of the key regions of the world. I defy you to try to come up with who are the regional experts in our government at the NSC or at state on areas like Russia or China or Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia. They virtually don't exist. And finally, there's this issue that I think is the most important one of all, and Lynn alluded to it earlier, and that's what has happened to our moral compass. What has happened to the United States in terms of the policies that we are practicing around the world that has angered the entire civilized community internationally. So I think it's time to end the hubris of the Bush administration and to restore some progressive humility to the geopolitical arena. Thank you.
Our next speaker was educated in economics at Dartmouth and at Princeton University, but he rose above that. He has been the director of the Washington-based Institute for Policy Studies since 1998. He's the co-author of 12 books on the global economy, including Global Dreams, Imperial Corporations, and the New World Order with Richard J. Barnett, which laid out the future world that was coming towards us in terms of the global economy. And the Field Guide to the Global Economy, which is a wonderful handbook, if you have ever seen it, on how to think about and what the facts are of the economy, the global order that the corporations have forged. The reason we've invited John here today is the Institute, under John's leadership, has just come out with a new study called Just Security, an Alternative Foreign Policy Framework, that challenges, and I think does an extraordinarily good job of challenging the central assumptions and the limits of those assumptions of our current security policy, and argues from the posture of what do we need to do in fact to deal with the emerging security concerns that we now face, and how is our current policy serving or failing us, and what are the alternative ways we should move. To talk about that, John Cavanagh.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for creating in these 3 days something you called for in The Nation magazine a couple weeks ago, which is a kind of ideas primary, which is what we've got here. I also want to say I'm humbled looking around the room. There are some terrific experts on security here, and so I really look forward to the conversation. It's wonderful to have Lynn Woolsey here with her smart proposal. There's Colonel Ann Wright, Susan Scher, Mark Raskin, many others here who know a great deal about this topic. And also we're joined here by some of the great leaders of the progressive media in The Nation and in these times, and Alternet and Tom Paine, and it's wonderful to have all of you. I don't think it's often that you're all in the same room together as well. So as Bob mentioned, tomorrow, after an intensive 6-month study that involved experts from 5 different foreign policy arenas, we at the Institute for Policy Studies will be releasing a report entitled Just Security. It offers a comprehensive rebuke of Bush's foreign policy, and it details both a just security budget and a new framework that we feel will make the U.S. more safe and secure. Now, let me be clear on this. We believe that Bush's foreign policy, as well as much of the Democratic Party, and we studied to our dismay the core document that the Democratic Party released last year, which is called Real Security, that both of them start with the wrong premise. They both start at the center that we are in endless war against terrorism. They both treat terrorism as the central challenge to U.S. security. They both focus their efforts to address terrorism mainly on military solutions, and neither challenge the U.S. defense budget, which Mel Goodman so eloquently spoke about, that has ballooned to over $650 billion a year, well over 10 times what any other nation spends on defense. Now, in striking contrast, our just security task forces remind Americans that we can change course drastically, just as Franklin Delano Roosevelt shifted course in the 1930s through a good neighbor policy based on mutual respect for other nations. Let me also remind you, both Mel and Lynn alluded to this era, that as recently as 1993, the end of the Cold War, none other than former CIA Director William Colby suggested that the U.S. could cut its defense budget in half. Instead, we've doubled it. In this report, we recommend that the United States can cut its defense budget by at least 1/3 and still leave the U.S. and the world more safe and secure. These designated cuts come primarily from 3 areas. The first is ending the Iraq War now. And we should, Lynn Woolsey did not speak about this, but we should applaud her efforts to fully fund the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq. That's number 1. Number 2, shutting down 1/3 of the over 1,000 military bases that Bob Borosage mentioned that Chalmers Johnson has counted. We're simply calling for shutting down, starting with 1/3, and then we'd shut them all down. If you shut them all down, you can cut the budget in half. So we want to work towards that. We're putting together a task force to look at the orderly shutting down of those bases and the orderly bringing of hundreds of thousands of people who work on those bases into the U.S. economy to help rebuild a clean energy transition. And finally, the third big source of funds is shutting down 11 obsolete weapons systems, which should have been shut down at the end of the Cold War. If you put these and some other things together, you come up with $213 billion of savings that can go to the real security threats of America. We would recommend that $50 billion of that $213 billion that is saved be invested in more cooperative forms of engagement through diplomacy, as well as other effective non-military means to address terrorism. And in this context, I do want to applaud both John Edwards and Dennis Kucinich, who have challenged this war on terrorism frame of our foreign policy. Now, if you took this set of $213 billion in cuts, as I said, you could have put it towards what we consider to be 3 overarching challenges to U.S. security, which are even more severe than terrorism. And that would be climate, poverty, and nuclear weapons. And let me say just a word on each. The major challenge to our security in the world today is climate chaos, which threatens the lives of billions on this planet. The report rejects the current approach, which again is largely bipartisan, which centers on false solutions that glorify technological fixes, such as the misnamed clean coal, as well as biofuels, and the over-reliance on market solutions such as carbon trading. Instead, we press for caps on carbon emissions, for a carbon tax, and for the sort of comprehensive investment in a clean energy transition laid out over lunch by the Apollo Alliance. We also propose a global carbon fee on trade to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and generate funds to help nations make the transition to clean energy. And here, as an aside, I feel like credit should go where it's due. I applaud Chris Dodd for embracing both carbon caps and carbon taxes. The second core challenge to our security is global poverty and inequality. And today, we like to count things at IPS, and this is a shocking figure. Today, the world's 946 billionaires have collective wealth that is as great as the poorest two-thirds of humanity. That's 946 people versus over 4 billion people, a gap which represents a time bomb that threatens democracy and global stability. Both Bush and most Democrats offer in response disastrous free trade policies and ill-thought-through aid packages. Instead, our just security response offers an end to free trade agreements, to all of them. We spell out a shift in aid towards a massive investment in a public health Marshall Plan that would train 4 million new public health workers, primarily in Africa. And on the current immigration debate, we must learn from how Europe integrated poor nations into its union. Instead of building a big wall, the centerpiece of this new proposal, they worked to level the playing field through effective aid and stronger social protections so that once borders were lifted, there was no exodus. The Bush administration has refused any such approach towards Mexico or Central America. On the third core challenge to our security, which, like climate chaos, can end life on this planet, is nuclear weapons. Here, our report will shock you by applauding at least two people we've spent a lot of time fighting: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and others who earlier this year called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Yeah. We will put Henry Kissinger in jail as a war criminal, but we will applaud him on his nuclear weapons. And we urge that a small portion of the $213 billion saved from our bloated defense budget, a total of $5 billion, go towards non-proliferation programs focused on securing and dismantling stockpiles of nuclear material around the world, particularly in Russia. Finally, we suggest that just security requires comprehensive solutions to regional wars, and we start with that most intractable of regions, the Middle East, by joining Jimmy Carter in calling for an international process under the United Nations to secure a viable peace between Israel and Palestine. And the other region we folks spend some time on, the author of that section, Amira Woods, is here, is Africa, where we speak out against this disastrous new Bush administration fool's errand, the Africa Command, which is a proposal to militarize Africa to counter China in its rush for resources on that continent. We end our Just Security report with what is the only effective way of changing course: an appeal to all of you, an appeal for public engagement to transform our foreign policy. And here I would urge, many of you are stalwarts of the war against, of the movement, peace movement in the war against Iraq. Many of you are outspoken against spreading that war to Iran. And I would argue we now need a strong third leg in our movement, which is a national conversation about foreign policy. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement have all transformed U.S. society. Because of these movements, we've become a more just society, a more diverse culture, a more international country. Immigration has changed and is changing the composition of our population. To quote the song, "We are the world." It is time to change our foreign policy so that it looks more like America and also reflects that strain of American tradition, that strain of justice. Many of the ideas and proposals in this report have broad support among the American public. Majorities of Americans believe that no nation should possess nuclear weapons. They reject the notion that military force should be used to promote democracy, and they believe that immediate steps should be taken and significant resources to halt global warming. We need leaders and we need social movements that can translate this broad American appeal into an integrated program for American renewal. We believe that this program must be founded on the principles of just security laid out in this report. The social movements that have made U.S. society more just must now make U.S. foreign policy more just. As Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So let me end by inviting you all over the next year to join us at IPS in a national conversation on a just security transition. Thank you very much.
Now, what's striking about this is these are common sense ideas that are simply not heard in the halls of power in either party, really, with rare exceptions like Congresswoman Woolsey. And it is the power of our movement that we ought to be able to change that, both by having our own conversation independently and challenging the limits of this debate, and by demanding that our representatives that now control committees and subcommittees begin to hold the hearings and lay the basis and air the ideas and open up the discussion so that this debate is not a limited debate between two right-wing parties. Our last speaker, I've given a specific task to. Her name is Anita Sharma. She is the executive director of Enough, which is a new initiative of the Center for American Progress and the International Crisis Group designed to abolish genocide and mass atrocities. She has served recently as the governance advisor in Indonesia, has held international posts there in Iraq, Jordan, and Kosovo. She served as the director of the Conflict Prevention Project at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and she's done this all without being over the age of 25, as far as I can tell. She's also been very active as an advisor to losing Democratic presidential candidates, as have myself, and so I understand that role. Being an advisor to Kerry and Gore. But the reason I asked her to speak is all of us have a sense about Iraq that we've got to stop a very bad and foolish war, a very bad intervention. And at the same time, many of us carry the same a sense that we ought to be intervening to stop genocide in Darfur and elsewhere. There is a conflict there. It's not enough to say, well, we intervene for a civilizing purpose in Darfur and for a fearful purpose in Iraq, because all empires intervene for civilizing purposes wherever they intervene, or at least that's the language. So we have to think very clearly about humanitarian intervention, about whether we should do it, how we should do it, how we make it international, in fact, as opposed to a national decision, how we make it responsible, and yet how we do not allow our opposition to the wrong-headed war in Iraq turn us into a movement that doesn't understand the need to stop genocide and to fight genocide across the world. So it's wonderful to introduce Anita Sharma.
Thanks very much. That's a wonderful introduction, and I definitely do have some big shoes to come after, and I will definitely do my best. I won't be focusing so much on intervention, because one of the things that we are trying to do at the Enough campaign is focus on the idea of prevention and this notion of the responsibility to protect, which says, focusing on, as we heard earlier, that the use of force should come after exhaustive efforts have taken place on the diplomatic level, economic sanctions have put into place, and in such case that you do use force, it is indeed through multilateral institutions, ideally with the United Nations. So with that, let me try to explain what that means in terms of Darfur, and then also the ability to create a global constituency of people who care about preventing mass atrocities and ending genocide. So not only in Darfur, so not only 5 years from now, potentially you will not necessarily have to have another save, fill-in-the-blank coalition to end these types of atrocities, and that's what we're attempting to do at the Enough project. Interestingly enough, we're focusing on Darfur, northern Uganda, and eastern Congo, and those are areas where some of the worst human rights violations are taking place in the world, but we're also working to develop long-term institutional changes in the United States, in the United Nations, and elsewhere to help both prevent, respond, and mitigate the future challenges. Enough has been, you might have seen in other places move on used enough in terms of talking about the surge and the escalation, and then also in England, enough has been used to discuss the opposition to the occupied Palestinian territory. So we're in good company, I think, but this enough is solely focusing on preventing genocide and mass atrocities. I'd like to thank Bob and everyone else at the Campaign for America's Future for organizing this important event, as well as for choosing the topic of Darfur during this panel, especially during a time when wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominate our attention, investments, and manpower, and it's often difficult to think beyond those challenges. However, due in large part to the tireless efforts of activists ranging from faith-based organizations to students, the issue of Darfur has stayed very high on the agenda. And interestingly, it's an issue that progressives and conservatives can agree, probably one of the few issues. Genocide is wrong and must be stopped. Across America, you have evangelical Christian organizations. They have linked hands with progressive Jewish groups, students from all over the United States, and very diverse lawmakers such as Senator Dick Durbin, Congressman Donald Payne, Senator Sam Brownback, and Congressman Frank Wolf. They've all championed the cause by introducing and supporting legislation to end the violence in Darfur. Now, in terms of a progressive foreign policy and on a moral issue, stopping the violence in Darfur is just the right thing to do. In addition, there is a growing recognition that situations involving mass atrocities, and they are integrally linked with other American interests. The same government that would harm its own people, or in areas where there is no viable government, they are likely to foster the same instability and chaos that provides the breeding grounds for terrorism, trafficking in drugs, arms, and persons, pandemic diseases, allowing for mass refugee flows, and other threats to international peace and security. Now, if America engages in a strategy of a more integrated power, one that seeks to protect the American people, prevent conflict, and lead vital alliances and modernize international institutions, it is better able to respond to those types of threats, challenges, and opportunities of today. So what does that mean in terms of Darfur? Now, in the past 4 years since the violence has erupted in Western Sudan, a tremendous groundswell of activism has erupted in an effort to bring about an end to the 21st century's first genocide. However, despite the world's repeated pledges of never again, our collective response to genocide and mass atrocities has rarely matched our stirring rhetoric. Again and again, the international community has failed to act decisively when confronted with the specter of innocent civilians being killed in large numbers. Now, several factors contribute to this paralysis. Public opinion is rarely mobilized until after the killings reach a crescendo, and only then is when global decision makers define these crises as humanitarian challenges, but even so, they don't accord them the required attention and response. Indifference and inertia drive our inaction. The world is often reluctant to stand up to those committing the worst abuses or take the risks or make the investments that can stop and prevent these crises. Now, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to mitigating, preventing, and stopping mass atrocities, but an effective framework that takes into account the necessary measures to prevent these situations from arising, the responsibility to mitigate them when they do, with a whole range of responses is what I was saying before, including humanitarian protection provisions and punitive measures, which range from the persuasive to the coercive, and the responsibility to rebuild and engage after conflict and supporting durable peacemaking efforts. Now, ultimately, this new norm is articulated as the responsibility to protect. It takes this notion of humanitarian intervention and the duty to intervene, turns it on its head, and says that states have the right and the responsibility to protect their own people. And when they are no longer willing nor able to do so, they lose that right of sovereignty. This R2P principle was unanimously adopted by heads of state, including the United States, and governments at the UN's World Summit in 2005. Now, it talks also about the types of measures that the international community can embark upon, as I was saying, and ultimately including at the end, if necessary, military force. Now, the tardy and inadequate response to these atrocities by the international community undermines our collective moral authority and leads the perpetrators to conclude, rightly and disturbingly so, that there is little price to be paid for committing crimes against humanity. Now, how can we change this dynamic? First, citizens must make it clear to policymakers that they have a strong interest in stopping the atrocities, and they are willing to support government action. Second, the international community must have the capacity to act nimbly and with the flexibility and resources to resolve these types of complex political emergencies. And third, government authorities must exercise that all-elusive political will that is required to incur the risk of significant human and financial cost and potential failure. That is what we're trying to do at the Enough campaign, which is aiming to educate, mobilize, and empower American citizens who believe that it is within our moral foundation to deem inaction unacceptable, and it is within our national security interests to have such strong leadership. Now, in Darfur, it's estimated anywhere between 250,000 to 400,000 people have died in this conflict, and at least 2.5 million people are displaced from their homes. The conflict has moved from Darfur into the neighboring Chad and Central African Republic, and the violence has been called a genocide by President Bush, Congress, and then Secretary of State Colin Powell. Humanitarian organizations have mounted an impressive effort in an extraordinarily difficult situation. It is the largest humanitarian situation in the world. The relief effort costs more than $1 billion a year, and it involves some 14,000 aid workers, and they're trying to assist some 4 million people. Now, it happens all the time. It's been happening for the past 4 years that the government of Khartoum gives an inch and then takes a mile. And if you've been watching the recent news, they have agreed to the allowance of the UN peacekeeping forces into the region. Now, we're treating that with a healthy dose of skepticism because we have heard this before. Their latest kind of caveat was that they'd be African Union troops, but they seem to have walked away from that a little bit. But still, even so, that new force is not expected to be sent until next year. And when it does, it will face a chaos in Darfur and an even more complicated military and political environment than at the start of the conflict. The rebel groups are fractured, tribal militias fight amongst themselves, and there is currently no recognized ceasefire. Now, this agreement comes after 4 years of constant cajoling, haranguing, and threatening to the government of Khartoum. But still, as something that Bob was saying, a lot of people have believed that the non-permissive military intervention should have taken place by now. However, it is my opinion that there's a difference between doing nothing and what they also say is sending in the Marines. There's a whole host of graduated responses, as I was saying, that can range from the imposition of a no-fly zone, adopting targeted multilateral sanctions against Khartoum, imposing economic and financial measures, and pushing for international divestment from Sudan. At the same time, we could use the African Union, the Arab League, and the Chinese to use their pressure with Khartoum to stop the killings and permit the entry of the UN force. And secondly, and unfortunately, this is the legacy of the Iraq War, it is not clear that military intervention would have the expected outcome. Potentially, it could come at the risk of even greater violence, especially if Khartoum resists. In the wake of U.S. engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in light of growing U.S. tensions in the Islamic world, Darfur could become a flashpoint for larger conflict. Again, it's not the difference of doing nothing and sending in the Marines. There are other options. Basically, what is needed in Darfur is the resumption of a peace process and a political solution and settlement. And this is something we've heard earlier today in terms of Iraq. It is not something democracy or peace cannot come through the barrel of a gun. This is hard work. It's going to require diplomacy and long concerted efforts. At the same time, we're calling for the deployment of the African Union and the UN hybrid peacekeeping mission and the immediate cessation of violence by the rebels and government attacks against civilians. Now, in the case of Darfur, the American people have made it abundantly clear to their elected officials and the rest of the world that they want action. And in fact, not since the anti-apartheid movement have you seen a collection, as I was saying, of this diverse group of people who care so deeply on an African issue. And it's interesting because these networks are expanded out, they're educating, they're mobilizing citizens in very non-traditional ways through the internet, targeting local actions through state divestment divestment efforts in congressional districts. It's using media events such as rock stars and singers and rappers and professional athletes to help reach America's youth, or people not normally associating with the types of issues, and they're turning them into advocates. And this is something that my boss, Gail Smith, who's at the Center for American Progress, calls the democratization of foreign policy, of which you are all members of. Now, the excellent work of Save Darfur, Genocide Intervention Network, and others has really laid the foundation for this constituency. And efforts like Darfur Scores or Sudan Divestment Task Force, all of this you can find online, by the way, they make sure that elected officials are well aware that the public is watching, supporting, and judging their efforts. If you go to Darfur Scores, I haven't looked, Congresswoman Woolsey, to see what you're rated, but I'm sure it's quite high on Darfur Scores.
It's 100.
Interestingly, some 6 presidential candidates have been to the region. Most of them have made public pronouncements and statements on Darfur, so at least they are giving the impression that they are aware and know and care deeply. Now, if this norm is ever to become real, however, the proper civilian and military resources must be put into place with the full support of leaders and those who advocate for peace in Darfur and elsewhere. We need an effective early warning coordination and response machinery at the center. Oh, sorry, okay, I've been watching. And an effective diplomatic capacity ready and able to negotiate and mediate these situations. It's exactly what we were talking about before. We're very focused on building up the civilian capacities to respond. The issue, it's an old adage, when all you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and until the civilian capacities are built up to match the military ones, it will be constantly the military who is called on to respond. I know I have to stop, but I just wanted to say a quick word about China and the Olympics, and I'd be happy to talk about that in questions afterward. But some of you are involved with the efforts in the campaign within Beijing for the 2008 Olympics. And this is not China bashing, but this is encouraging China to be more responsible and proactive with Sudan, who, because they are Sudan's largest trading partner, both in terms of oil and weapons, they have a huge role to play in encouraging Sudan to stop the violence in Darfur. And again, I'll be happy to answer more questions about that. So basically, in sum, there's some really good news that there's a growing consensus that the world cannot stand idly by when the state fails to protect its own people, and is also, in some cases, what I was saying, is the actual perpetrator of genocide and mass atrocities. And I think together we will be able to see this movement through in the long term. So thank you. Sorry. I wasn't watching.
Okay, now it's your turn. Questions, short comments. Give us your name, any identification if you'd like, and we'll go. Yes.
My name is George Truitt. I noticed a lot of talk about Save Darfur. I guess 4 times the amount of lives have been lost in Congo. I believe the highest number in Darfur goes around 600,000. The Congo as well, over 2 million. There's a difference between the two. Everybody hear those cell phones going off? Those computers you're using use things like coltan, which is from the Congo. We actually, as Americans in a progressive agenda, you can actually do something to quit using the products that are done from that. In fact, Darfur is almost an easier way because it depoliticizes things like our trade and the economic interests that are vested in things that exploit places like the Congo. So you're going to see the military-industrial complex and focus on Sudan because it does have oil in the south, whereas people are making money off of the chocolate they're all going to enjoy. A lot of it's going to come, 70% is from the hands of slaves and so forth. And I think it's almost interesting that we will focus on one, whereas 4 times the amount come from products that we're using here today in our electronics, coltan.
Is there a website where people can check in?
I know Democracy Now! Had an interview with John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman writer. He went over all of this. Most of the things I'm pulling up are just normal, mainstream things. A lot of the policies that
Appreciate it.
Security were before Bush went into office. I think we're not talking about that as much.
Terrific. Thank you. You want to comment on this?
Yeah, I would just say our website is enoughproject.org. We focus on Darfur and Congo, northern Uganda, and not one over the other. Yeah, you're exactly right. In Congo, it's estimated that 1,000 people a day die from neglect and disease and war. It's Congo is considered an economic basket case, a political backwater, and definitely you're right, has not achieved the proper attention that it deserves. It's our hope that by leading and creating the constituency of people who are caring about Darfur, that we can start to show how the region is connected, going beyond Darfur. But good point. Yeah.
Your website again?
It's www.enoughproject.org.
Yes.
Nick Lenzo here. I'd like to address this to Congresswoman Woolsey from a political perspective. The Republicans, unfortunately, over the years, seem to have succeeded on many levels in associating spending money with being tough on terrorism or defense, and they get away with this crap. I think a strong case can be made politically that if you were Osama bin Laden and you were going to hand George Bush an agenda that you would have wanted him to do from 2001 on to now, it would have been pretty much what George Bush has done. There's a perverse confluence of interests, from my perspective, from what is good for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and what is good for our military-industrial complex. The two of them feed off of each other. And George Bush may be deluded and incompetent, but the forces behind him aren't. What I'm saying is, there's a lot more here to this than meets the eye, and there are ways to get that across to the American people. That this is all, on some levels, it's about money.
It's all about money and oil and power and control, no question. And I've spoken on the floor 210 times for 5 minutes at a time about what's going on in Iraq, and I speak to that over and over again. And you are absolutely right. Thank you.
Aggressive on that.
Well,
Yes.
Alec DeBroe from CompPain.com. John, Congresswoman. Chalmers Johnson once said that the major threat to U.S. security is the residue of slavery. There is a direct link between the militarization of our internal police forces and the increased militarization of our foreign policy. But no one here has made the link. Do you agree, disagree? Is it a avenue for discussion?
John?
Yes, I agree. I agree with almost everything Chalmers Johnson writes. I think the way both the Republicans and the Democrats frame the national security debate, most Democrats, not the 72-member Congressional Progressive Caucus, is that the biggest threat is terrorism, and we must fight it militarily, and there is a trade-off in terms of our domestic civil liberties. And so I think at the core of a just alternative foreign policy is a very strong stance for the basic civil liberties, the basic First Amendment rights, the basic rights of people in this country that we fought for hundreds of years ago. And we should not accept that there's a trade-off between security and those rights. We simply shouldn't. So I would agree with that.
The only thing I would add to that, and I agree with what you're saying, is that we have never really gone back to assess the impact of the use of the military and the use of the CIA in the Third World in terms of how they've used power, particularly military power, whether it's regime change or covert action or supporting revolutionary groups in Angola or Mozambique, or some of the most reactionary groups in Afghanistan, which led to the formation of the Al-Qaeda organization. And this is the debate that has to take place in terms of how we use power, because we have misapplied power, and we need to be reminded about what President Eisenhower said 46 years ago in terms of not only the military-industrial, but what Eisenhower wanted to say but scratched it out at the last minute was military-industrial congressional power, because there is too much cooperation at that triangular level.
Lynn?
well, there's another piece to this, and I'm not going to repeat what they're right on. I echo their remarks. Education. We don't educate people in our kids in our own country, and the press doesn't educate the adults on what our choices are, what's really happening, how to analyze, how to question, how to get to the facts. I mean, thank heavens for all of you. Imagine if you weren't around. I fear that sometimes our education system is ignored so that we can have, you say police force, I say a military force. Where do kids go? if they don't have any opportunities other than going into the military. We have a lot to do in this country to bring people into the real world and help them see what's really happening to them and to their rights.
Yes, sir.
Charles Riggs. With respect to Iran, we seem to be hearing a lot of the inflated claims of WMDs that we heard 2 or 3 years ago with respect to Iraq, despite the fact that the IAEA has said all the physical evidence points to low-level enriched uranium, unusable for nuclear weapons and only usable for nuclear energy. Just last month, a group that I joined from Move On visited Carolyn Maloney's office, and this was one of the concerns we expressed, in response to which she sent us a letter expressing sympathy with our concern about Iran's nuclear weapons program. I think that kind of proves the point that there is I think I've seen this term on the web, there's a meme out there, a meme, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, that Iran has nuclear weapons as opposed to merely a nuclear program. This is a propaganda problem that the right wing at the neocons have created for us in terms of a slide into war with Iran. And I don't hear it being challenged from anybody in Congress, even though there are folks in there like you, and even Congressman Maloney, a member of the Progressive Caucus who voted consistently against funding, are in there and supposedly know that this is going down. I'd like to know.
Okay, first of all, you can't have every single thing that we need to be talking about coming out of a handful of members. I mean, I'm sorry, I wish I could, but right now, my mouth is about bringing our troops home and getting them out of Iraq, because that's as little time as I have control over in the press and in the Congress. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe it's a change. The administration needs a change of conversation. They're pushing for it, and they're doing it again through fear that what will happen to Israel if Iran has nuclear weapons, and it's bigger than big, and it's frightening. We had a vote on, do we insist that the president come to the Congress before he go to take any actions against Iraq? It was voted down. So pay attention. I mean, the majority of the Congress voted not to force the president to come to us before he takes any action in Iraq.
Just at one quick point, there's no point in bringing the troops out of Iraq on a Monday if they're going to end up in Iraq out of Iraq if they're going to end up on Iran on a Tuesday. And what is missing in the debate, and here the role of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees are particularly important. Iran's actions against Americans and the British sailors and holding Americans in jail did not come out of a vacuum. We are conducting special operations in Iran. We're conducting covert action in Iran. You have a president who's talked about a $75 million appropriation for democratization of Iran. We did that to them in 1953. They know what we're talking about. So until we stop these covert measures, you're going to see increased provocative actions from Iran. They see this as self-defense.
Back there.
Back to Darfur. Any estimate on the number of refugees that have left Darfur and the Sudan and have gone elsewhere, and what countries have taken them in?
Yeah, there's about, as I was saying, there's about 4 million displaced. About 1 million they actually, on top of that, they're outside of humanitarian access. Darfur is about the size of France or Texas, depending on which comparison you want to make, and it's really difficult to get to. Most of the refugees who have been displaced outside of Darfur are in Chad and the Central African Republic, and that's further destabilizing those countries as well.
Medea.
First of all, the amount of money of the $650 billion, just to give you a sense, that goes to both Iraq and Afghanistan is $141 billion. It's a huge amount. The bulk of that is Iraq. It's $90 billion, but that leaves a huge amount for Afghanistan. I think the progressive movement was more divided about Afghanistan than it was about Iraq, in the sense that Afghanistan was a place where a failed regime was giving sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. We take the position now that the intervention in Afghanistan has been a disaster. It has not, like the intervention in Iraq, it has not lessened terrorism. It is recruiting thousands of new people into terrorist cells every day. And we are for an end to a military solution in Afghanistan, and, as with other crisis spots in the world, an increase in the machinery of diplomacy and multilateral institutions. We don't think it can be done. We think you can do it very quickly in Iraq. We think you can announce a timetable for withdrawal in Iraq right now and do several things to get the troops out of Iraq within 6 months. We think in Afghanistan it will take a little bit longer, but that the same process, the same logic is at play. You cannot solve the problems of Afghanistan militarily.
Let me thank our panelists. I have to let you go. The next session is going to start. Just Security is in your packets, if you haven't noticed.
I actually brought some reports under for if you're interested.
I haven't read the whole thing.